I want to welcome all of you to a very special offering of Book Talks, which is a series of conversations with authors about their books, hosted collaboratively by Pittsburgh Theological Seminary's Center for Writing and Learning Support in the Barber Library. Today's Book Talk is also co-sponsored by the Doctor of Ministry program here at the seminary, and I want to welcome one and all, both people here under the tent and people online. We have some people joining us via webinar, so we welcome them as well. Yay, so glad y'all are here. My name is Shan Overton, and I'm your host and the director of PTS's Center for Writing and Learning Support and the faculty mentor for the Doctor of Ministry program in Creative Writing and Public Theology. Yay, yay for the, yay, yes. Additionally, just so everybody's aware, especially those of y'all hooting out there in the under the tent, we are recording this event. Be aware. It'll be linked to our website after Bobby scrubs it up a bit and cleans it up a bit. For those who would like to revisit it, or for those who missed part of it or were not able to attend at all and, want to look from the website. Tonight, we're going to, in a few minutes, after I finish saying a whole bunch of things, welcome Gareth Higgins up here to the podium. His new book is How Not to Be Afraid, 7 Ways to Live When Everything Seems Terrifying. It invites readers to re-examine our assumptions about fear and to consider ways to work with and transform that fear into something hopeful and life-giving rather than death-dealing and stultifying. How Not to Be Afraid was published in 2021 by Broadleaf Books. It's a book that Nadia Bowles-Weber deems trustworthy. Mickey Scott Bay Jones calls a much-needed resource for skill building through our fear and trauma. And Kathleen Norris, who says she is no fan of self-help books, but believes this one is a gentle, open invitation full of hospitable storytelling that allows us to find ourselves in its pages. We are very pleased for this book talk to be a stop on Gareth's U.S. book tour. For those who are in the audience tonight under the tent, we will have a reception and book signing following our conversation. And obviously, we've started the reception because we had a few delays with our IT, and now we're here live. So continue to enjoy the reception all the way through to the end. The book signing, obviously, is going to be to my left here following our conversation. For those who are online, if you look at your chat window, you'll find links to Gareth's website for the book and to bookshop.org, both places where you can purchase the book. I have a few people to thank before I introduce our guest of honor today. First, Michelle Spomer and Tisha Wu, who work in the Barber Library, who've created a series of library guides, which are also known as LibGuides for book talks. Those who are with us online will see the link for the LibGuide to tonight's book in their chat. If you click on the link, you'll go to the library's website, and you'll find many resources that are linked to our conversation about Gareth's work. And the librarians do a great job with this, so I hope even those that are in the physical audience here under the tent tonight will take a chance to check out the LibGuides website because it's really wonderful work. I'd also like to acknowledge my colleagues Ramona Spencer and Jane Larson, who are in the Doctor of Ministry office and put together this amazing reception, the tent itself, and made a perfect night for us. For those who are online, it's a beautiful night, perfect temperature here in Pittsburgh, and I'm sure that Ramona cooked that up for us. So we couldn't have done it without her and without the Office of the Doctor of Ministry. Also, I thank our communications department, Melissa Logan and Robin Menard, for helping us get the word out about the event. Our administrative assistant, Holly McKelvey, who registered people, And a big shout out to our IT department, Bobby Jarsulik, here in the middle of the crowd. He takes care of all of our technology issues and is acting as our cameraman tonight. So we're grateful to Bobby and the whole IT team. I also want to thank Jack Miller over here to my left, a student in the D-Min program in Creative Writing and Public Theology, who will be watching the chat for your questions for those of you online, and will be voicing them. Thank you, Jack. If you are online and would like to ask Gareth a question during the event, please type it in your Q&A at the bottom of your screen. If you're here in person, we will have time for you to come up to the microphone, which is over there to Bobby's right. And we want you to ask questions too. Many of you have been in conversation with Gareth all week. This is a chance for you to get to ask him the question that didn't come up in class or that's been sitting with you all week. Those of you who have not been in the class, we really hope you'll come up and ask some questions, because I think you're going to have some interesting thoughts stirring after hearing from Gareth. So please, we want to hear your voices. It's not just about me asking Gareth, questions. One final note. Those who are online will note a live transcription button at the bottom of your screen if you would like to read along with us. And now, let me tell you a bit about our guest, Gareth Higgins. And many of you who've read the book already know most of this. But Gareth is a writer born in Belfast during the Northern Ireland Troubles, now living in the U.S., mostly, yes. He was co-founder of the 028 Project, a faith-based peace and justice initiative in Northern Ireland. He is a retreat leader, was founding director of the Wild Goose Festival, and has appeared regularly on BBC radio and in podcasts. Gareth has written and spoken widely on religion and conflict, art and spirituality, and film, with his work appearing in The Independent, The Irish Times, Sojourners, and Third Way Magazine, amongst others. He's also worked as an editor with Sojourners and in his own publication, Porch Magazine. In addition to How Not to Be Afraid, Gareth's books include Cinematic States, America in 50 Movies, and How Movies Help My Soul, Save My Soul, Finding Spiritual Fingerprints in Culturally Significant Films. He holds his doctorate in sociology from Queen's University in Belfast. Gareth is currently serving as a faculty member in the Doctor of Ministry cohort in Creative Writing and Public Theology here at PTS. And we are more than pleased, indeed overjoyed, to welcome Gareth here to talk about courage, creativity, community, and to consider with us new ways we might tell our stories. We begin tonight with some stories from Gareth. Then we will dive into a conversation about the book, especially welcoming your voices and questions. Gareth, I turn it over to you.
It's all right. I can keep reading that introduction all night long if you want. Thank you, Shan, and thank you, everybody, and thank you, people watching elsewhere. It's been one of the joys of my working life to be here this week and be working with most of the folk who are in this tent have been listening to me all week long, and so I appreciate your resilience. And those of you who haven't been with me, welcome and thank you for coming. There was a time, I believe, in most, if not all, of our lives when we were completely secure. There was a time when the concept of fear had not even entered our consciousness. There was a time when you were in something that later you might have recognized as a cave. It was a warm cave. It was a wet cave. It was a safe cave. And it was the only place you knew. There wasn't a single moment when you became conscious that you were there, but there might have been a moment where you realized, oh, I think I've been here for a while. all you knew was the warmth of this cave. All you knew was the security of this cave. The liquid surrounding you was magical, so magical that you could breathe it. And if you had very enlightened cave keepers, every now and again you might hear what you would later come to understand as music being played from outside the walls of the cave. This was paradise before you knew of the term. But then one day, the walls of the cave collapsed, and the water rushed out of the cave like a tidal wave, and you were thrust down a tunnel that got narrower as it got longer. And if you had had the word for suffocation in your mind, you would have said, that's what's about to happen to me. Some of you didn't even get to go down the tunnel. Some of you, the ceiling of the cave was ripped wide open, and Godzilla hands reached in to grab you. But whether you were grabbed by Godzilla or expelled at high speed or really, really low speed, on the other side of this, you would have been greeted by the kind of light that hurt your newborn eyes. It must have felt like dying to be born. It must have felt insecure. I mean, the next thing these Godzillas did to you was they cut the connection between you and the cave. And then, hopefully, you were placed into the loving arms of the owner and tender of the cave. Being born must have felt like dying. If it is true that the foundation of all fear is the fear of death, then all we need to do is to tune into the fact and become conscious of the fact that the worst thing that could ever happen to us has already happened. We were removed from paradise. We were removed from a security so deep, we didn't even know the concept of insecurity. And while I imagine for most, if not all of us, there are times when we might like to just go back into the womb and hide there, frankly, that's what the arms of others are for, or a good duvet. Or meditation or other contemplative practices. I imagine there are times when we might just want to go back into the womb. Most of us would agree that our first death turned out all right in the end. That all the joy and rich and meaningful experiences and the pain without which life wouldn't be a life with choices and risk, all of that would not have happened if you had stayed in this unconscious security. Some people think our culture is going through a kind of death, and maybe it's a kind of birth, and maybe they're both happening at the same time. All of us, I think, have had more than one experience of dying and being born again. All of us have had more than one experience of feeling like it's all over, but on the other side was something better. If it is true that the foundation of all fear is the fear of death, there is good news. We've all been there, done that. The only invitation is to get conscious about that and live our lives in the light of what an ancient teaching says: be dead, be completely dead. then do whatever you want. It's all good. Some of you have heard me tell a story about being at a conference where a man speaking at a lectern was trying to generate some funny anxiety in the audience by saying he was going to name the most sinful member of the church on the whole island of Ireland. He was trying to make a point by making a joke. He was going to hit the punchline saying the name of the most sinful member of the church in Ireland is the tongue, because the King James Version of the Bible refers to the tongue as an unruly member. And his point was going to be that the stories we tell, the way we use our words, can literally kill and it can literally create. And so this is an invitation to get conscious about the way we use words and the stories we tell. And unfortunately or fortunately, on the night that this conference was taking place, the speaker had not counted on the fact that there was childcare facilities at the conference. And if you were a parent and you had a child in the childcare facility, you had to sign them in and say where you would be. And if you were going to be in the big room where this conference was taking place, they didn't have cell phones back then. Instead, they would send 2 ushers into the room with a big piece of cardboard on which, with a paintbrush and red paint, the name of the parent had been painted. And they would send these 2 ushers in and they would walk around the room holding the cardboard up to alert the parent that their child needed them. And if you saw this in a movie, you would consider it cliched and not realistic. But this is exactly what happened, because I was in the room when it took place. At exactly the moment when this speaker said the name of the most sinful member of the church in Ireland is, from the right, in come 2 ushers holding up a big piece of cardboard on which is painted the name of one of the parents in the room. And they walk across the front so as not to disrupt the speaker. You know, it's a sensible idea. And this wave of laughter filled the room. The parent ran out of the room, and I saw her the next day, and she said she was totally fine. She was only ever concerned for her daughter. And the rest of us experienced this kind of mass benign hysteria that lasted for minutes on end. The speaker actually sat down on the stage crying with laughter. When a lull came across the room, he got back up again to try to give the talk one more time, and ultimately abandoned giving the talk because laughter so hard you can't breathe was just contagifying everybody in the room. And there were 3,000 people there. It was a moment of glorious humor, and the beautiful irony in it is the theme he was trying to illustrate, that our words have power, was perfectly embodied by what happened, because the words on that piece of cardboard meeting the words that he was speaking literally created something. What they created was mass benign hysteria and a memory that 27 years later I still talk about, and I remember his sermon even though he didn't preach it. It's possible to change people's lives with one sentence. I overheard Keith from Belfast in 1994 in Camden, New Jersey, not very far from here. I overheard him saying to somebody else, "That's Gareth. He's my best friend." Now, it's lovely when someone says it to you. It's actually lovelier when you hear somebody else say it. One sentence can change your life. And I think we've probably all overheard people say things that aren't as nice as that. And sometimes we go and clarify with the person. Turns out they didn't say it at all. And sometimes we thank somebody for a compliment that they didn't pay us. Words and stories, I don't know that they create reality, but they certainly massively shape our experience of life. This book, How Not to Be Afraid, has the wrong title, because it's not a book about not being afraid. The title is kind of a trick. The title, How Not to Be Afraid, is a little bit like What Not to Wear. It doesn't mean don't wear anything. It doesn't mean how to stop feeling fear. It means we're gonna feel fear in this world. We're gonna feel fear once we were expelled from that cave. Fear is completely natural. It's a biological and evolutionary necessity. It protects us. It's why we put our seatbelts on and don't walk too close to the edge of a cliff. The problem is we are bombarded with information today that is exponentially more than any humans in history have ever had to confront. And we have more connections, exponentially more connections than any human beings in history have ever had. The good news is we have access to more knowledge and perhaps more wisdom. And the bad news is the devices we carry around in our pockets and the gatekeepers who have access to publishing things that go to those devices are responsible for themselves. And that means there are wise people who never would have had a platform before that I can check in with every day and find out what they're thinking and saying, and that's incredible. And you don't need me to tell you what the opposite of that is. Or maybe I'll just say there are people who are differently wise or not wise at all, who are projecting, as Bruce Cockburn would say, projecting their shit at the world instead of in a therapeutic context or with their friends. And there are people who are out there just consciously lying and twisting things, but I think for the most part, it's just people haven't learned how to grow up in the way that they communicate. Or let's say lots of people want to grow up in the way they communicate and just haven't been mentored in that. They haven't found a community yet that will help them. How Not to Be Afraid is about helping us find a way to be afraid healthily. I'm afraid every day. I feel afraid every day. Often I don't feel the overwhelming fear that I used to feel. Often, not always. And depending on what I focus my attention on, my fear can go up or down. If I'm reading headline news constantly on a scroll, my fear will almost always go up, 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 up. I don't think the answer is to bury your head in the sand and divorce yourself from reality, but I don't think headline news is a proportionate picture of reality. I think that the first of 3 steps toward not conquering our fear, but transforming our fear, the first of 3 steps is to experiment with the idea that what you are experiencing when you are experiencing reality is a story you're telling yourself about reality. The story may be more or less true, but it is not reality itself. It's a story about reality. If the story's less true, it would be better to find a way for the story to be more true. We'll never get the full truth. And the story can be true and told in a less helpful way. This is kind of a facetious comment. There's a movie, I really wish I could remember what the movie is, where a guy goes to get his medical results from medical tests, goes to see the doctor, and the doctor is a very slow talker. And if anyone remembers what this film is, please tell me. The doctor says to this very nervous patient, "Welcome. I have your results. You're dying to know the results, aren't you?" That was a true statement, but it was not told in the most helpful way. So my question is, could we acknowledge that our relationship with reality is a story, and it would be better to seek a path to a more true and a more helpful story? The second of 3 steps is to form communities with small groups of people who are on the same path. A path toward emotional maturity, toward waking up psychologically, toward taking life seriously but not taking ourselves too seriously, and checking in with each other about, hey, what do you think about this thing that I feel afraid of? Have you got any help for me? Which could include, actually, you don't need to be afraid of that. Or could include, yeah, I'm afraid of that too. And solidarity can, in a context that's wise and accountable, can actually diminish the fear. Rosa Parks said, knowing what needs to be done does away with fear. And being on our own all the time in this, it's rare that we actually know what needs to be done. Unless we know that what we need to do is go and talk to another wise person. That's usually part of the process. That's the second step. Form communities, and if people read the book and they take away two things, it will be form communities that ask these specific questions that I'm going to share with you in a moment. And the third step, which is to breathe more slowly. We are rushed in this world in a way that's not natural. There's a reason that all major spiritual wisdom traditions agree on at least two things. One is some variation of only do to others what you would have them do to you, or don't do to others what you wouldn't want them to do to you. And the second is take time apart. Sometimes that means physically removing yourself on a thing like a retreat. More often it means remove yourself within yourself. Practice some form of meditation, even if it's just slowing down your breathing by 10%. There are people who've practiced this so much that it's just the way they breathe. It's just the way they breathe. Don't start this practice while you're driving, right? But if you slow down your breath by 10% for 1 minute a day, you'll want to do more of it. You'll want to do more of it. And when we form these little circles, we call them porch circles, and we do a little bit of slow breathing. It's not dramatic. And you need between 3 and 8 people in these groups. The reason for 3 instead of 2 is that 2 people often, when there's 2 people and they're talking about meaty stuff, one will often dominate the other. But if there's 3 people, it's harder for one person to dominate or talk so much that they're hogging the space. That's why when I go to dinner parties at people's houses, I always bring a lectern with me. And then people don't think it's weird that I'm talking all night. It makes airplane travel difficult, but the questions we ask are, what's life-giving to you since we last met? What's one thing that's life-giving to you? The second question is, what's one thing that's not life-giving to you since we last met? This is not the same question as, how you doing? Nobody knows how to answer that question. We either say fine or we lie. You know, unless we've practiced this with the person that's talking with us. What's one life-giving thing and what's one not life-giving thing? And the point of naming the thing that's not life-giving is not to feel the despair and the depression, it's simply to name it, bring it into the light. St. Ignatius of Loyola had different ways of asking these questions because he wasn't as accessible as I am. He said, what are the sources of consolation in your life? And what are the sources of desolation in your life? The point is not to feel the desolation, it's just to say, I'm having trouble with this thing. Just name it. The third question, and I think it starts to get kind of revolutionary when we come to this question. The third question is, how do you feel called to serve the common good between now and when we next meet? Another way of putting that is, what's the better story you feel called to live? And it can be really helpful to break it down to a very specific example. I have often said in response to that question, the next time I'm at a grocery store, I want to have eye contact with the person serving me at the checkout and have some word of connection and thanks to them. Because I often see people working at checkouts being treated like drones. And of course that doesn't mean that that would be the only nice thing I would do between this and the next meeting. But if you name one thing, it's like seasoning. It'll spread to everything else. And over time, if you form circles like this and really get to know each other, you can get clear about this place where your passion and your wound and the needs of the world and a spark to come alive are all overlapping with each other. And we could learn from each other. What are you called to? What are you called to? This is what I'm called to. I'm trying to do this thing with my life. And then we could give each other feedback and say, I've known you for 6 years. I really don't think you're called to that. Or you're doing a really great job on that path. Or I've seen you struggle heroically to fit into this mold. I'm not sure that you deserve the punishment you're giving yourself. I think somebody else told you a long time ago, this is what you're supposed to do with your life, but you're not. There's something else that's golden or a diamond for you, and we can help you get there. And then the last question, and when you have groups of between 3 and 8, you can actually set a timer and just ask people to talk for 1 minute each for each question. You can go deeper if you want to, but this doesn't have to take a long time. The last question, which subverts economic realities and plenty of structural injustices, the last question is, having heard what we've heard, does anybody here want to ask for some help? And does anybody here want to offer some help? And that's an open round. And it can be anything from, I need a babysitter this week and I can't afford to pay one. Can anybody do that for me? It can be, my closest friend just died suddenly and I'm deep in grief. Can someone help me with my grief? And someone very close to me had that experience in one of our circles. And for quite a period of time, that's what they would say in this circle. They would talk about missing Dawn, and people in the circle would offer support to them. Another one could be, I'm having an existential crisis and I need someone to go for a walk with me for 10 miles every Saturday for the rest of my life. And a good response to that would be, I'll give you 2 Saturdays and then we'll see how we're doing after 2, because that might be enough. Sometimes we need help to concretize our request, because sometimes it's so overwhelming we don't know even where to start with the help we need. And then if you really want to get radical, I can't afford to pay my rent. Can this circle help carry me for 3 to 6 months and it not be a loan and it not be a handout, but part of the energetic exchange of equity within this group, and I'm going to offer you something else in return, but it isn't going to be money. I know so many people who, if they had a circle like this, they wouldn't need to be religious. You don't need to be experts. You don't have to be trained. You just need to read a piece of paper that has these questions and then find ways to revise them so they work within your community's culture. I know so many people who have carried lifelong burdens of unnecessary suffering because nobody ever came alongside them and said, I'm going to help you learn how to ask for help, and I'm going to help you learn how to give help. And I'm going to help you find your own dignity as a person with a calling to serve the common good. This notion that people who write books and have platforms are the ones who are serving the common good and the rest of us are listening. I know nobody actually says that, but our culture definitely behaves that way. It definitely says people with a spotlight on them are more important and better, and that just isn't true. What they are is they have a higher degree of responsibility for the impact of their words. That's what any of us have. We're all responsible for the intended and unintended impact of our words as best as we can be, no matter what our sphere of influence is. And I know so many people who are so gifted and so beautiful and so tender and so loving and are already giving so much, but nobody has shone a spotlight on them, and so they don't believe what they're doing is worthy. I've said to most of the people here this week that I think people who are oriented toward compassion and the common good could benefit from a healthy dose of indignation. And I mean magnanimous self-dignification. I mean saying, I am beautiful. I am wonderful. I do not have to put up with the insults and the arrows of a culture that says I'm less than. And in fact, the people who are throwing those arrows, they don't deserve to live that way either, because that's a really terrible way to live. To just be a spite hose. That's a beautiful new word I've just invented. A spite hose. Someone who hoses spite all over people. I think it comes from a Latin word that we can conjugate later on. So I think one of the answers, or one of the pathways to transforming fear, honestly, is a kind of healthy self-righteousness. And I think that movements for compassion, while we have cancel culture and we have ideological purity and we kick people out for getting one tiny little thing wrong, that's going to change. We're moving through that, actually. I think we're moving through that as a culture. I think there's a healthy self-righteousness that we owe ourselves. And it's a self-righteousness that just has a much enlarged sense of self. It's a self that includes all other selves and says, I'm wonderful, but not over and against you. We're just as wonderful as each other, and I need your gifts to flow, and you need mine. There is necessary and inevitable suffering that's going to come our way. If there is unnecessary and not inevitable suffering, wouldn't it be good to just find ways to avoid that healthfully? Let me finish with a story. In April of 2005, I was in South Africa at a conference on art and reconciliation at the University of Pretoria, Tshwane. And Archbishop Tutu was chairing this conference. And I got to sit in a conference with him for a week. It was amazing. The following week, I went to Cape Town with some friends. On the Thursday of that week, it was Maundy Thursday, the day before Good Friday, which in the Christian tradition is the day when alms are shared with the poor. To this day, Queen Elizabeth usually attends a church service on Maundy Thursday, and there are big charitable donations that get made, not to make her look good, but to encourage other people to do the same. She's mirroring kindness. I wanted on Maundy Thursday to go to Mass at the Anglican Cathedral in Cape Town, where Archbishop Tutu had served during the height of the apartheid era. And there was a story I had been told that has recently been confirmed to me by someone who heard it from the late Archbishop himself. And the story was that during apartheid, one night there was a service taking place in the Anglican Cathedral in Cape Town, and members of the South African secret police came into the church and lined the walls of the church and started taking names and maybe even taking photographs of the people who were in the pews, like Bobby is doing right now, but not on behalf of the South African secret police. I hope. Would you tell us? You wouldn't tell us if you were? That's okay. I've worked with you this week. You are definitely not with the South African secret police. Or you're just extremely good at hiding that fact. So, those of you who can't see Bobby right now, Bobby is shrugging his shoulders in a potentially innocent fashion. And so this was an attempt at least to intimidate, if not actually potentially arrest people. And Archbishop Tutu, maybe some of you have heard this story, Archbishop Tutu got down out of the pulpit and went up to these South African secret police officers and said, "It's great to see you, thanks for coming. I never expected you'd come to an anti-apartheid meeting." And then he said, "Of course we know that's not why you're here. But I'll tell you this, tonight, you could change your lives. Tonight, you could take one step in from the wall and join our movement. And you would become honored members of the anti-apartheid movement, because we know that that one step you take would actually be a giant leap. Because for you to move from there to there is a massive thing. You'd be leaving your community behind. You'd be risking something. But I will also tell you that nothing you've done up till now will be counted against you if you join us tonight. There's always room for redemption. That's all it takes. Take one step." And then he said, "But if you don't take that step, in a few short years from now, when our victory is obvious to the whole world, in the war that we've already won, if you don't join us, all you will have will be your shame. Make your choice." So I wanted to go to this church. This was many years after the end of legalized apartheid in South Africa. I wanted to go and be in this cathedral. I wanted to just, I don't know, soak up the atmosphere, pay homage. But on the way from my hostel to the church, a young man stopped me and demanded some money, not in a friendly way. So I gave him a little bit of money, and then he opened his hand and showed me a box cutter knife and said, "I don't want to stab you, give me more money." Now, I've done some nonviolent communication training. I've been around people involved in mediation work and peace and reconciliation, negotiation, and it is my understanding that in any negotiation across issues of intractable difference, it's important to secure common ground at the start. And so I appreciated him telling me that he didn't want to stab me, because I didn't want him to stab me either. And that was something we could agree upon from the beginning of this encounter. It's not a good opening line, by the way, if you're going into, like, if you're going to negotiate for a pay rise, don't go in and sit down and say, "Listen, everybody, just want you to know I don't want to stab you." Because while that's probably also, they don't want that either, it's not a good opening gambit. I was scared. And I had been around people who know about nonviolence, and I'd heard a lot of stories that had changed my thinking, if not my practice. And this thought entered my head: tell him you're late for church. And it sort of rose up inside me with indignation, which turns out to be genetic in my family. A self-righteous indignation. I took a note out of my wallet, I slammed it into his hand. That was the only act of physical violence that actually did occur between us that night. I said, "I'm late for church," and I stormed off down the street. And I started to shake, and I was having a shock reaction. He did not pursue me, and I don't know if I'd given him as much money as he wanted. I don't know if my words had caused a revelation inside him. I think more likely what had happened was I'd broken the channel of fear feeding on violence, feeding on rage, by doing something that he didn't expect, and I didn't expect it either. I took a cab the rest of the way. I didn't want to walk anymore. And that led to the first open door of blessing to me that night, because taking a cab meant I was there before any other member of the public. And you've all visited cathedrals that have been full of people. Well, I was in one that had nobody in it except about half a dozen ushers. I had about 15 minutes in this cathedral by myself. I sat at the back. They had handed me the order of service on the way in, and it was hard for me to read it because my hands were shaking. And then when I stabilized my hands, I read the order of service and was reminded that this was the service of alms to the poor on Maundy Thursday. And I do not justify people threatening anybody with a knife. I don't care what's happened in your life or what your circumstances are. There's no justification for threatening people with a knife. And what flashed into my mind was, this guy's ancestors and my ancestors might have met. And I don't think it was his ancestors that had the weapons. And there's a both and here around the behavior in the moment and what might have led to it and what my reaction should be to it. The following week, I was back in Belfast, and the Saturday after Easter 2005, Pope John Paul II died overnight. And then some anti-Catholic graffiti went up in Belfast, and this was nothing new. There's always been anti-Catholic graffiti, there's always been anti-Protestant graffiti. There's less of it. Decreasingly less, is that the word? If it's decreasingly less, does that mean there's more? Yeah. We'll do the math conversation later. There's less of it. And one of these pieces of graffiti was on a red brick wall of a supermarket parking lot. It said, "Where the F is the Pope now? Ha ha." And there was this part of me just thought, this is so just insipid, spelling out your laughter and rubbing the faces of the people who you consider to be your political opponents in you making fun that someone they cared about has died. And of course, this, this was probably done by teenage boys who had nothing else to do. That's probably who did it. But we realized that it was going to be seen maybe by tens of thousands of people the next morning, the Monday morning, because we noticed this on the Sunday afternoon. And then people would call the radio talk shows and say something like, did you see what the scum put up on the supermarket wall? Without commenting on the irony of using the word scum to refer to people who had dehumanized somebody else. We get into this oppositional energy thing, this rivalry thing, this thing where my dehumanization of you is justified because you did something I didn't like, but your dehumanization, and it would probably take a week before the local government and the supermarket could agree over whose responsibility it is to paint out the graffiti, and by then the damage would have been done many times over. Anybody who had any sense of affiliation to Catholicism, either as a religion or as an ethnic identity, would have felt offended and maybe intimidated by this. And a good number of Protestants would have felt embarrassed too. But there also, let's face it, would have been a number of people who would have looked at that graffiti and thought, nice one, we got one over on them again. It's always a game of tit for tat. We've always got to make sure that the ball's in our court, and worse. So myself and a friend called Stuart, and in one of the many noble examples of what happens when US-American foreign policy is turned toward the common good and uses nonviolent or peacekeeping tactics, Jacob from Montana, who was living in my house at the time, decided to go out at 4 o'clock the next morning and paint something on top of the graffiti. We didn't want to just paint it out. We didn't want to whitewash it. We wanted people to see what was originally there, and then we wanted them to see another message that transcended what was originally there. I did not have language for this at the time, but I've become absolutely compelled and captivated by the idea that Richard Rohr has advanced, that the best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better, because oppositional energy always recreates itself. That doesn't mean that we don't have to oppose things sometimes, and sometimes we may need to lay down our lives to oppose those things. Those are rare occasions. But if we're going to oppose or protest, we better have a plan for what we're going to do to create as well. We better have a plan for what we're going to do afterwards. And it's often better just to start with that plan. So we went out with a bucket of paint. You can't buy paintbrushes at 4 o'clock in the morning in Belfast, so we took a bathroom sponge from my house and we drove over to this wall in darkness. And we read a passage of ancient Middle Eastern poetry about turning swords into plowshares. And we prayed the prayer that came from the tradition that we knew best. Thy kingdom come and thy will be done. And we went over to this graffiti that said, where the F is the Pope now. And they weren't polite enough to just say F. It was the whole word. And on top of it, we painted, I think, the least used word in politics and the most powerful word that we could start using authentically, and that word is sorry. Wow. And we painted it 5 times so people could drive past and see where the F is the Pope now, transcended by sorry, 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 sorry. And we felt we had the right to say sorry because we were part of, or at least perceived to be part of, the same community that did this, although we were middle class and privileged and powerful and didn't have any reason or need to go out and paint graffiti. And I'm sure if we had different life circumstances, I could just as easily have been the person who painted that. Now, I have a mixed background. I am 50% Indigenous Irish Catholic and 50% Northern Irish British Protestant. And that used to be a massive struggle for me because it meant I felt I didn't belong anywhere. And now I realize I sort of belong everywhere, and sort of everything's my fault, and sort of everything was done to me, and sort of maybe that's kind of more true for most of us than we think. We don't actually need to divide ourselves into victim and oppressor. We need to discern, what have I done with my privilege, and what am I going to do with it tomorrow, no matter how small or large it is. We didn't tell anybody what we'd done. Well, we didn't tell too many people what we'd done. I mean, those of you who know me, of course we told some people what we'd done. but we didn't issue a press release about it. And we didn't feel like we were kind of any great shakes. And it didn't feel courageous. It felt scary and exciting. Like courage doesn't feel like courage. Courage feels like fear. This felt a little scary and a little exciting. It was on the BBC TV News the next night. It was on the second page of the main Protestant newspaper the next day and being spoken of as a positive thing. And the best that I heard was, at the end of that week, a community worker friend of mine told me he had been at a meeting where people from the working class Protestant community and their leadership were engaged in trying to rejuvenate that community. And in fact, these days, the lowest levels, if that's the right term, and I'm using that term advisedly, the most under-resourced levels of academic achievement and economic well-being are inhabited in working-class Protestant community in Northern Ireland. There's a very complex story that's unfolded there. That is not to say that there are not disenfranchised Catholics, but this is a beleaguered community. And this community worker told me that a major leader in that community had said to him, I don't know who it was that painted out that graffiti, but I'm glad they did, because my journey to using violence and going to prison began with me writing anti-Catholic graffiti as a teenager. And I don't want that to happen to my sons. I want something better for them. So I don't feel like I deserve a medal at all. I tell this story so much simply to identify with all of you and the courageous, fun things you have done, and many of you have done things that are way more risky than that. And you know that sometimes the fearful thing is the right thing, and sometimes it's a frightening thing and an exciting thing at the same time, and sometimes it's actually quite simple to figure out what it is you're supposed to do, and then just go and do it, and then go home and have a cup of tea and some sandwiches, and make sure you got good people around you, and breathe more slowly, and ask people for what you need, and offer them your help, and discern where your heart and the needs of the world meet. You will never conquer your fear. This book is intended to help you realize that maybe you don't have to. Actually, you could use your fear to fuel a better life. You've already died once. It's gonna happen again. I don't want it to happen unnecessarily to any of us, but we can't control the future. We do have some say over what's happening right here, right now. And I am more healed in this area of my life every time I get to talk about it. It is surreal that people listen to me about it. It is an enormous gift, and I would love to be sitting there listening to each of you tell these kinds of stories too. So it's not taken for granted by me that you're here listening to me tonight. I'd love to have some conversation with you. I really appreciate you being here and letting me see the light in your eyes. Thank you.